and thank you for joining Vermont Film Essentials. My name is David Metzger.
And I'm Lincoln L. Hayes. We are discussing the classic film, The Graduate, starring good old Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft, Kathleen Ross, and others. When was your first introduction to The Graduate?
So, I'm going to try to get through this whole episode without entering hyperbole, because I love this movie so much. I can without a doubt say that it is, if Jaws did not exist, that this would be my favorite film of all time. But such is the case with Jaws. This is number 2. So back in, once again, high school, my friend and I did that AFI list, and we just kind of went through it, and this was the one film that was like this and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where we're like, all right, we have to, that's where we start.
Yeah.
And just from the jump, this film it hit me right at that right time. I like to think of this as like the cinematic equivalent of Catcher in the Rye, where you read it in high school, it hits those feelings that you're going through, and it's just the right moment at the right time.
Yep.
And I always felt like the things that I love about the 70s films and the late 60s films is that they really tapped into that outsider, rebel spirit.
Yeah.
And in high school, especially if you're a film nerd, you definitely feel like an outsider, and you feel like you got your little tight-knit group that understands you.
Yep.
Until you go off and get into the world.
Yeah.
And this film just tapped right into that.
That's interesting that you mentioned it in relation to Catcher in the Rye. I didn't read Catcher in the Rye in high school for whatever reason. I was like that one outlier that just didn't read that book. So then when I did read it later in life, it didn't have the same impact on me because I passed all of that. I feel like that might have been the same instance with The Graduate, because I saw that for the first time only in my late 20s. So it wasn't that same kind of what am I going to do with my life feeling that you have right out of high school, right out of college in your early 20s. And I can understand why this is one of your favorite films, one of the highest rated films in history. But for me, it's missing something. And I think it has a lot to do with pacing in the first act. And also just it makes me uncomfortable, the subject matter. Which is weird, because in doing my research, I learned that Anne Bancroft was only 8 years older than him at the time of making it. But they put so much makeup on her, and they make him 20 instead of 28 or 29 when he was filming it, that's always just kind of been an uncomfortable to watch for me. That's always just been like, oh, well, that's a little weird. But that's kind of the point. And there are certainly aspects of the movie that are great. There's great cinematography, great performances. It's really well written. There is a lot of humor to it. But when I was reading how it was voted one of the best comedies of all time and stuff, I was like, it's not really that funny. There are funny scenes, but the movie itself isn't. I mean, to call this a comedy and to call Dr. Strangelove a comedy, that's kind of interesting that those are in the same genre, It's a very good film. I just don't know that it's that amazing in my mind. But again, that has to do with me seeing it so late in life.
Right. It's weird. I had an argument when the AFI Best Comedies list came out, what you're talking about. I was at a family gathering, and my uncles and I got into an argument because my one uncle turned to the other and was like, yeah, did you ever think of The Graduate as a comedy? And they're like, and he's like, no, that's not a comedy. And I was the one who's like, well, what would you call it?
It's certainly satirical.
I didn't know if they were saying, I don't call it a comedy because I don't think it's funny, or if I don't call it a comedy because it's so much more than a comedy.
Sure, and I think that's more in the camp that I'm in.
Right.
That it is funny, but to only call it a comedy is kind of a misnomer. Yeah.
There is, it's funny that it makes you feel uncomfortable, because the one thing that I think of specifically at that time in high school, when I did feel sort of, you can't help but feel like an outsider.
Sure.
I also feel like there was a moment where I felt like I was born in the wrong time, because
definitely.
I connected more with films of this era, music of this era, And I don't know if there was a time where my parents were like, "This is our music. This is our these are our movies. Like, what are you?
Why are you so
why are you
into
getting
this?"
so much out of this?"
Yeah.
But I just did. Like the Simon and Garfunkel music, I can't. I loved it so much. I loved his voice so much, and the fact that this movie uses it in the way that it does use it,
Right.
and it speaks so much to the
Which
themes.
is uncharacteristic for the time, for sure, to have pop music that isn't directly related to the goings-on of the film, to just kind of have it be tonal and atmospheric almost in nature. The only other movie I can think of that does something similar, actually, is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, with Burt Bacharach's Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. And now that feels so out of place in that movie.
Right.
And I kind of feel like a little bit, not to the same degree of that song, but I feel like some of the songs are kind of in there to be in there, if that makes sense. That he's like, Paul Simon, write me some songs. And he's like, here are some songs. And he's like, I'm going to use all of these songs in this movie, whether they always work or not. But it does take me out of it just a little bit sometimes.
Right.
Not enough that I'm like, no.
Well, because he uses it in such a dynamic way in terms of, he'll repeat songs.
Yeah.
He'll repeat the song, but just use the music, not the lyrics. And I always thought that, if this and Jaws have anything in common, it's that they have the way I love that each act is a separate tone and a separate movement.
Yeah.
In that, Jaws starts as kind of a mystery, gets into a little bit of horror and a thriller, and then the last act is a big grand adventure out to sea.
Yeah.
And with this film, it's like, it starts as this symbolic coming-of-age story, turns into this kind of romantic farce with elements of drama and romantic comedy and, heart-tugging, satirical tones. And then the last act is just like, him going to win back his love in a very, highly romantic,
grandiose way. Yeah.
But it also has that strange edge to it. This is it is a very strange film that really, I can't separate it because it hit me right at that right time where it's just like I can't see the forest for the trees for this movie. This movie just is my favorite, and that's it. But it is a very strange film that I don't know sometimes why it works the way it works.
I agree with that.
Others.
I agree with that 100%. I was talking about it with the wife, and I was saying that I watched it again, and I've seen it a couple times before, but not in a couple years. And I watched it again, and I was like, I like it, but there are parts of it that I'm just like, oh. The beginning, unfortunately, is paced very slowly, and it makes perfect sense within the story, but man, it's kind of a chug to get to the point where he's consistently having the affair with Mrs. Robinson, and then their life, and then their conversations that they have, and then eventually, him meeting Elaine again, and then the love story continues on in that vein. But the performances are so good, and just the sheer amount of information about the casting process of this, like almost everybody in Hollywood was considered for this movie, or screen tested, or auditioned, or turned the role down, or something. And to think that this could have been a Robert Redford film is just mind-boggling.
It's so Mike Nichols has this, he's so funny when he tells his stories, but they wanted Robert Redford. And he was considering it because, he worked with them in Barefoot in the Park and on stage and all this stuff. And at a certain point, he just said, you can't play this part. You're not right for it. And Robert Redford's like, what do you mean? He's like, you don't know. Have you ever struck out with a girl? And Robert Redford's like, what does that mean? Yeah. And he's like, exactly.
Yeah.
You're not.
My point exactly.
But Dustin Hoffman is just so fantastic, and
he's just so neurotic and nebbish and just so strange, and the way that he develops the character of Benjamin from when we first meet him and he's out of college and he's got all these accolades and he doesn't know what the hell he wants to do, and then he starts the affair with Mrs. Robinson, and then he just becomes lazy and just a layabout and just, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I don't care.
Yep.
All I care about is that almost every night of the week, I get to have sex. And that's great. That's good enough for me at 21. And I've been there. I was there. I mean, that's all you want sometimes. You just want to do nothing but that which is pleasurable to you. So I feel like anybody can relate to the character of Benjamin, for sure. I don't know if we can necessarily relate to the idea of taking that affair with an older woman or an older man, what have you. But I also like the idea that Mike Nichols initially wanted to cast an older French actress as Mrs. Robinson, because in French culture there's kind of that idea of the older woman teaching the younger man the ways of sex. But the producers were pretty much like, absolutely not. We're not doing that with this movie. That's not what it's about. Also didn't know it was based on a book. Found that out in my research. And it is has been adapted for the stage as well. It ran in London and on Broadway.
I
And
think,
regionally in the U.S. as well.
Lorraine Bracco was Mrs. Robinson, at least in the initial run on Broadway.
That sounds familiar. Kathleen Turner did it as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
So it definitely is the performances. There's also just a sure. Mike Nichols is just one of my directing heroes, and
The man knows how to make a movie.
he knows how to make a movie. But it's also so weird that he started on the stage. Definitely he and Elaine May had their comedy routine. It's historic.
Yep.
But he started on the stage, and then he was going to do this first, but then he got offered the chance to do Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So he just said, like, I'm sorry, I want to do this first before I do this heavy thing here.
Yeah.
And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, I think, eventually down the line we'll get to this movie, but it remains if anyone wants to know how you adapt a stage play and turn it into a film, it is the shining example. And you just get a sense with that movie that he was falling in love with the camera and what you can do with it and editing. And in this film, he was just like, open it up.
Yep.
I'm gonna love that. I'm gonna fall
Everything
in love with
we know.
the long lens, the long lenses that he uses.
His use of focus.
Focus.
To take the audience into the character's mind. There's that famous and wonderful shot of Kathleen Ross once he reveals that he's having an affair with her mother, where it cuts back to her and she's still out of focus until the realization comes to her face, and then the focus comes and you're like, it's so, that's such a perfect visual to get you right in there with her, and just like pulls on your heart and you're like, oh my God.
And those are the types of things that I feel like it benefited Mike Nichols to be a stage director before he became a film director, because those are the things like, how do I, on the stage it's like, how do I use the lighting to tell the story?
Yep.
And with this it's like, okay, I'm using the camera, I can use the focus, how do I use the focus to, and what is the best way to visually show a person coming to the biggest, most horrific realization of their life? And that's
use
it.
the focus, yeah.
And then there's he goes out of the room. It's a close-up shot on Anne Bancroft saying goodbye, Benjamin, and then it just does that quick zoom out, and all of a sudden it turns into a two-shot, and he's in the foreground, and she's in the background.
It's a beautiful, simple shot.
Yeah,
But
to
it's
tell
so effective.
Here's the
Here's the gap between us now. Yeah. I mean, that comes from stage directing as well, creating physical distance between characters to create an emotional distance as well. And so rarely does that happen on film, because it is such a small media that you have to get the characters close to each other. But it's a beautiful shot of her, and then it pulls right out, and there he is, and you're like, oh wow, look at the space between them. The man is a fantastic director. We should say. He passed.
Sad.
Few years ago.
The other thing that I think, there have been people who say that as they grow older, this is a film that meant so much to them when they were young, but as they grow older, they kind of look at it with new eyes and they say, you know, oh, poor alienated youth, poor you.
Yeah.
All these feelings that you're having that don't amount to anything.
Right.
And famously, Roger Ebert, you know, he did this glowing review when he first saw it in 1967, and then when they reissued it in 92 or 93, he writes, like, you know, it's basically just a movie about a dork that falls in love with a beautiful, gorgeous woman, and then ditches her and goes for her daughter.
Yeah.
And he just kind of, you know, belittled the whole thing and said, I don't know what I was thinking back in 1967.
Yep.
But I do, like...
He also referred to Benjamin as an insufferable creep.
Right.
Which makes sense. The other thing that's so crazy to me about this film is watching it long ago, whenever the first time was, Mrs. Robinson seems so much older. In my mind, she was like 50s, 60s. She's 35 in this film. Granted, they've got her in old age makeup, but still, she's 35. I'm 32 right now.
Right.
That's a little difficult for me to wrap my brain around, but I think what you were saying about...
that we're old.
that we're old, but also we're approaching Mrs. Robinson's age.
Right.
And should then we be pursuing 20-year-olds? No, that's not happening. But I think along the lines of what you were saying about people's opinions of it changing later in life, I'm getting to that point as well, where I'm watching things from my youth, what have you, where... I mean, especially even like the Harry Potter films, you watch them for the first time and you're on the side of the kids and they're like, oh, they're going to do all this stuff. But then as you watch it later in life, you start agreeing with the parents or the adults in the film and you're like, no, just do what they say. You're being ridiculous. And I kind of feel like I'm going to get to that point with this film too, where it's tragedy of Mrs. Robinson, of how she gave up everything that she had to marry this man with money and security. And she's miserable and hates her life, so she seeks out an affair with a younger man. I think both for the excitement of it, and this is a good question to present. What is her motivation in the affair with Benjamin, do you think?
Mrs. Robinson?
Yeah.
I think it's just, you know, they kind of touch on it a little bit when he tries to, you know, all she wants to do is just have sex.
Yeah.
It's just about that, you know, that I do think it's that fleeting moment of, you know, I want to recapture my youth. I want to be completely selfish here and take advantage of this kid to get something that I need so that I can feel young again.
Right.
And they touch upon it like when he's just trying to get her to talk and she doesn't want any of it. And, you know, what were you interested in college? Or no, she says, why don't we talk about art?
Yeah. She brings it up.
Yeah. And he's like, he tries to talk to her and they get nowhere. Then he's like, what did you study in college? Well, I studied art. I was like, oh. Well, I guess you lost interest in it over time. And, you know, you do get that sense of like, I've lost something. And the fact that, you know, the marriage was just because she got pregnant.
Yeah.
So that never leads anywhere well. So I think there is a lot of psychological stuff going on, but there's a lot of psychological depth to her. The more and more you watch it and you pay attention to the dialogue and the little looks that she has or the little phrases that she says, and you know that again is Mike Nichols coming from that stage background of let's flesh this out, let's write these little backstories and these little bios, and let's get at the heart of why you're doing what you're doing. You know, it's funny you said the thing about you know, Harry Potter, but my joke is when I was a kid, nothing meant, you know, I loved The Breakfast Club.
Yeah.
Totally understood the angst, totally understood what they were going through, and now I watch it and I'm like, you bastard kids, go get a job.
Pricks.
Now
I'm
Mr. Vernon. I'm the principal, for God's sakes. But with this film, I think the one thing that it does right, and the fact that Mike Nichols is an adult when he makes this film, is that one, the adult characters they're not like in most of these movies where they're just dunderheaded, you know, morons that are just completely out of touch. Benjamin's parents, while they are very joyful and full of life, and you can look at it and say, oh, they're so aloof and they're so goofy, but that's just them, and you can tell that they have a really great marriage.
Yeah. They have a happy life. They're not just fixtures of parents in his life while he does things. They have their own happiness, their own successes. Yeah. And they just want what's best for their son, and they see him slipping into this weird funk, and they just want to get him out of it. And little do they know what he's doing, at the Taft Hotel most nights.
Mrs. Robinson is a fully fleshed out character. Murray Hamilton as Mr. Robinson is great. Even
Speaking of Jaws.
Speaking of Jaws. Hey, another connection. There you go. My favorite character is the landlord. I think he's awesome.
He's really good.
I want you out of here. I don't like you.
I don't like agitators.
He's great. But then there's that moment at the end that most of us miss or don't understand what it is. There's the look that they have at the end of this film when they're on the bus. Is the reason why you can watch this film, and while you can say, oh, it's just about the poor dislocated youth, at the end of this film you're like, aha, the adults get to say, now you get it. Now what are you going to do?
Now what?
What's with all this?
This is one of those films that the last moment is worth every moment prior.
Yep.
Everything leads up to that moment, and knowing the backstory of the performance of that scene is that much more interesting, because you watch it and they're laughing and they're so excited. They're like, we did it, we got away, we're gonna go do this. And then just the crestfallen, what does that mean? And knowing that the scene was shot, Mike Nichols was just screaming at them to laugh, 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 laugh. And then when they finally stop laughing, it's just the fear of them not knowing what they're supposed to do next, because he only directed them up into a point, and then he just kind of stopped, and then they're like, well, now what do we do? We're still rolling. And just that look of, oh my God, I don't know what to do.
I just pissed off Mike Nichols.
Yeah, this is the last shot of the film. We ruined it. And that translates into the character's fear of the unknown of now what?
And if Mike Nichols wasn't, he still doesn't know why he was that crazy to say that. And if he wasn't looking at it and saw those faces and said, that's the end of the movie. I got it.
Yep.
We're moving on.
Because as a performer in that moment too, you don't know that.
Right.
You don't know that that's what's playing. You're just crapping your pants thinking that you're not doing a good job. And then you watch the footage and you go, oh, that worked. Okay, yes, we did it. Good job, us. There are just such wonderful moments in this movie. Let's talk about its reception when it first came out in '67. Initial reviews were very good. People really, really enjoyed it, but as we've discussed, it's kind of lessened over time. I think the more people are able to analyze it and look at it, there are aspects about it that they don't like from a story perspective, I think. I think a lot of people look at it and they go, oh, this isn't what I thought it was about to me now. It's changed, like we talked about. And it has since slipped. It used to be number 7 on AFI's Top 100. It's now dropped to number 17.
Again, I don't know how unbiased I can be at this point, but I think part of it is because it is a youth picture, and a lot of these lists are generated by old people, by scholars or people that just look back and they say, like, let's reevaluate this film, let's see how much it holds up. And I think there is a way that you can look at this film and say, like, oh, there's a couple of little misses here and there, or, one of the things that always struck me is that, and this is just, I do think that this is still one of the great structured screenplays.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to know how to structure a third act, you've got to look at this third act. But also just, how you structure an entire script. But just because of the way the story is and the way that is structured, you do not get a lot of time with Elaine.
No. She doesn't come in until the last third.
Right. And, it's a credit to, everyone talks about how phenomenal Dustin Hoffman is, of course. Same thing for Anne Bancroft. Catherine Ross tends to get a little bit of the shaft with that, but I do think that there is something to be said for, one, you've got to be the girl next door, but also you've got to be the girl that Benjamin sees and says, I'm in love with you. And have that not
She plays a
feel
lot
like,
of different girls in this movie. She's the girl from next door, she's the girl that got away, and she's love at first sight. And their scenes together are, I think, a highlight of the film as well, which is why I'm pretty sure she got a Golden Globe for this film for Best Supporting Actress. But that scene when they go to the burlesque club, her performance is incredible. She's so hurt and wounded by how selfish she is. And it just works so well. And that, I'm so glad that is the tipping point for Benjamin's character as well, because I get it, you made the promise to Mrs. Robinson that you weren't going to let this happen, but you have to be human too. You have to see that you're hurting this girl for no reason other than the selfish reason that you're sleeping with her mom, awkwardly enough. But you just feel for her so much in that, because it's like, all right, yeah, I'll go on a date with you. This will be nice. We'll go out to dinner. And then he's just such a prick, the whole thing.
And it's so great that, again, a piece of costuming, but a visual way to tell that story and to tell that moment is, after he sleeps with Mrs. Robinson, the sunglasses come on, and the sunglasses is a way for him to shield the outside world and to just be in his own head and be in his own feelings and his own selfishness. And at that moment, he has those sunglasses on, and when she has hers, it's like, this isn't me.
Yeah. I need to take this off and be real with you and apologize for what happened. Yeah.
And then the whole, third act when he goes to Berkeley to find her. This movie, again, because it hit me at that right time, it's like all these little moments and these little feelings in that little section. The fact that Scarborough Fair is playing, and that's just a dreamy song. But the little things like him writing her name over and over again. It just, I get it.
David's a hopeless romantic. Yeah. I don't know if you know that.
The staring out the window and watching her leave, and then just the idea that I'm going to marry her. She doesn't know it yet.
She doesn't know it. She actually doesn't really like me.
Right.
But we'll get there.
That's such a great moment with the. I don't know if you noticed, but the toast pops up right at that moment where he says that he's going, and then his mom's reaction when I'm going to marry Mrs. Robinson is just so good.
The costuming and the set direction of their house has to be the most specific thing about this film, I think, because it's just so white.
Yep.
All white clothes.
Yep.
White or black, but it's always subtle black. And then Mrs. Robinson is always darker colors, or animal print.
Animal prints.
Yep.
There's a, that whole scene when Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. All behind her is it looks like a jungle.
Yeah.
And there's all these plants and everything all around. There's the bar and the liquor and everything. It's just, just.
The running joke that Mr. Robinson always pours him scotch instead of bourbon.
Right.
I thought that was really fun.
He has a little thing Dustin Hoffman does where the little nervous, and apparently that came from someone told Mike Nichols that when he, some big, I think it's Jack Warner, always told bad jokes. And whenever Jack Warner would tell a bad joke, Mike Nichols would just go, and someone told him that, and he's like, are you serious? All right, that's in the movie.
Yes. Yeah, his little nervous tics throughout the film are really great. And to see him overcome those and become more of a man, more of an adult, is really interesting too. To see how he picks up and continues smoking through the film, which is a very adult thing to do, very grown-up thing to do. The underwater motif throughout the film is great as well. He has the scene with the scuba gear and he goes into the pool.
Yep.
There's fish tanks in his room. The first time we see him, he's looking through the water of the fish tank to symbolize that he feels like he's drowning. Stuff that I didn't ever pick up really until watching it this time. And I was like, oh wow, this is really specific and interesting, but subtle as well.
Right. And the scuba scene too is just, it's one of those movie moments where you're like, this doesn't make sense, but visually and storytelling wise, it's the perfect thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, no parent is going to give their son, well, you know, it was the 60s.
Yeah.
But, you know, that he it's just, one, it's so funny that he comes out in this big scuba frogman suit. But then that he's just down there, and that shot is just so relentless as it pulls back.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right that it's so subtle of him looking at the fish tank and feeling like, oh, this is a man that's drowning. This is a man that's head above water, doesn't know what he's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just, you know, after being propositioned by Mrs. Robinson, it's like, you know, I'm completely submerged and not able to get out of this.
Yep. What are some of your favorite scenes?
There's so many scenes that just feel like if this movie came out today, they would still be inventive and innovative. I mean, definitely when he goes back in to put the dress or the jacket on the bed, and she comes running in naked, and you know, he spins around, door shuts. We just get those little glimpses, and he's so funny, just like, oh, Jesus Christ. And I mean, just the way that it's shot, like it's still shocking.
Yeah.
And it still makes you feel like, oh my God, like this is so uncomfortable, and this is so crazy that this is happening, but it's also so very funny. And
The
it just
quick
hits
cuts
you on those.
are great because it really makes you feel like your eyes are darting down and you're just kind of seeing it. You're like, I don't want to look, but I'm looking.
Right.
Also, if you're not looking at the screen during that scene, you miss all of that. Like if you look away for even a moment in that sequence, you will miss everything. And sadly, I had to rewind because I was like, I missed that whole scene. I wasn't watching.
All the things with him getting in the hotel room, the little bits of business between him and Buck Henry, so great. You know, him hitting the bell and he hits his hand. And, are you here for an affair? What? Great stuff. That
I love
he
the scene when
writes
he
his
goes
real
back
name.
with Elaine.
Yeah,
And everyone's calling him the
Everyone knows
wrong name.
Right.
They're just, do they know you here?
Hi, Mr. Gladstone.
We should probably just go.
He writes his real name and then
Takes that page.
takes it. Just fun stuff there. The whole the fact that he does this whole montage with April Come She Will, and then it goes into Sounds of Silence and then into April Come She Will, and it's just two songs back to back, and it's bridged by him. He's in one room, he walks out, he goes
That
into
sequence
another
is
room.
incredible.
Yeah.
So, my God, the
And it's all
editing
done
in
in
that
camera.
is fantastic. That's incredibly good filmmaking.
Yep. Him jumping out of the water, landing on the raft, and it smash cuts to him landing on Mrs. Robinson in bed. All these little transitions are just amazing to steal.
How long would you say the time frame of this film is? Because when it starts, he's 20, he's going to be 21 the next week. How long until we get on the bus with him and Elaine at the end, do you think? It's like a couple months, probably?
It's got to be.
Or is it closer to a year?
I always thought of it as like a, if it starts in spring or late spring, goes through the summer, then that's got to be fall when he goes to Berkeley to see her, right?
Right, yeah.
So I think it's got to be.
So it's almost like just a summer romance film, too.
Like like that song April Come She Will. I mean, just going through those, summer of love, and then the reality of fall hits, and what am I going to do?
Got to get back to it, yeah.
I would like to, if we may, talk about something that seems very elusive in terms of filmmaking, which is tone.
Yeah.
You know, it's something that I think about, and it's always hard to define. And there was a interview that I saw with Alexander Payne and David O. Russell, who are, you know, two filmmakers that obviously love this movie, are influenced by this movie, and just influenced by Mike Nichols in general. But that question came up is, what is tone? Or how do you get the tones of your film so specific? And Alexander Payne stood up and said, you know, it's hard to talk about that because, you know, you're the tone, like tone is you and you are tone. And, you know, you've been listening to David O. Russell speak, and, you know, he's volatile, emotional, blisteringly funny. He's got a great wit about him. And you look at his movies, and that's what defines his movies.
Yeah.
So that whatever, you know, whatever, that's what you bring. That's your voice. And, you know, as I started thinking about it, it's like, you know, well, you know, look back at the three films that I've made, like what is it about me as a director that I can bring? And, you know, they're quiet, introspective,
Sounds like David Metzger.
sometimes funny, you know, I guess that's me. So, you know, what am I doing making a dark, violent thriller?
Sure.
So I had to say, well, what is it about this story that means more to me that I can bring this quiet, introspective, emotional tone to it?
Sure.
And that's what I feel about, like, Mike Nichols, just as Billy Wilder before him, and, you know, James L. Brooks, Alexander Payne, Wes Anderson after. They just walk this emotional tightrope between comedy and drama, where moments are played for real, but then within that next scene, or even within the same scene, you're laughing.
Yeah.
And it's such a subtle, you know, it's such a small target, and they do it so well.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
It's honesty, I think.
Right.
It's finding the sincerity in any moment, and I think that comes from the stage, really, because you can have, in life, you have very serious, dramatic moments that are then punctuated with humor or lightheartedness, because as human beings, we don't like it to be that real all the time. We don't like it to be that raw. So if you're having a very serious conversation with somebody, inevitably somebody's going to make a joke just to add some levity. And they're able to do that so well with this film. The whole first act with him and Mrs. Robinson, his nervousness and his awkwardness keeps that from being almost like a weird thriller, almost of like an older woman preying on a younger man.
Right.
But since he's so uncomfortable and all of that, we're then with him being like, oh, well, this is interesting and uncomfortable.
Right.
Rather than, you know, being afraid.
It also
Or even
saves
then
it.
sympathizing with Mrs. Robinson, being like, this poor woman.
Right.
You're then with him being like, oh, this is a funny situation.
And also that it does play it real, and that nervousness and that anxiousness is real. It saves it from going to the other side where it could fall into just farce, where you know, you don't believe it and it's just goofy and it's just funny, and you don't, you know, there's nothing really at stake.
Yeah. What immediately comes to mind then is Arsenic and Old Lace.
Yeah.
Because that is farce. That you watch that movie, and if you're not invested in it to be a farce and that you know you're going to expect, Cary Grant is terrible.
Right.
His performance is so over the top and so just like, ho, ha, ho, ha. You're like, what are you doing?
Right.
And if that were in this movie, would not work. But since he, and as much as I don't like method acting, he is so methodical in the way that he approaches Benjamin in those early scenes that you feel uncomfortable. You feel what he feels, which is nervous, terrified, I gotta get out of here, all of that, but titillated at the same time. Because to get that attention from an older woman as a 20-something man is titillating. That's like, oh, okay, this is fun. I can roll with this to a degree.
Right.
And that, I think that's that where that degree is for me, that makes that part of the story uncomfortable for me. Because it's like, yeah, we'll flirt, but the fact that you go ahead with it, uncomfortable.
And that she's so, like, and when he tries to stop it, that she is so manipulative into how she gets him to do the act.
Yeah.
And that's real too. And I think, I totally get your feelings about that, but I think there is that moment where he's like, we can't, I way in over my head, absolutely can't do this. If my parents were here, oh my God.
Yeah.
And she just finds that little needle of, I didn't know this was your first time, and that's okay. It's okay that you're inadequate.
And then your pride steps in and it's like, I am manly man Hoffman. I will bed this woman. It's like, no, just admit it. There's no shame in being a virgin. God, chill out.
One other thing in terms of Mike Nichols and his directing style is he said this, that he's very big on statement of theme. And he's proud of the fact that, do you know what the first line of dialogue of this movie is?
Oh, wow, no.
So the first line of dialogue is, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin our descent into Los Angeles. And just with that one little phrase, he starts the ball rolling, and he's on that mechanical walkway, and then his luggage is on the chute, and it's just a young adult who is afraid of becoming just a cog in a machine.
Yeah. Also, in that first scene on the moving walkway, he is going right to left, which is unconventional because in Western society we read and perceive things left to right. So he's literally going against the grain, reverting, going into a descent. It's all just, in having that in my mind now, watching it again, all of those little pieces will add up. And that's what I love about so many of these movies that we're covering is you watch them, you have an appreciation for them. You do some research, you have such a greater appreciation for them. Just the little things that you don't even think about, like he's on a walkway. Walkways typically, when you're coming from the terminal, go that way. So let's film it that way. But that's going to be jarring to the viewer because we're not used to seeing that, even though we see it all the time. We don't see it on film. And for Nichols and the team to have that foresight to be like, this is going to be effective for this reason. I just hope that someday I have that kind of foresight making things.
And it's so, you want, I always, before, as I'm starting to make something, as I'm starting to direct something, like his voice is in my head, and he's got, there's a commentary on this between Mike Nichols and Steven Soderbergh. Oh, wow. Where it's just like a masterclass. And they also did it for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and Catch-22, and it's just like everything that he says, he's got this great quote where he says, you start making a movie and you think you know what it's about, but then you are in the editing room and it tells you what it's about. Yeah. And all of a sudden you rethink the whole thing, and then you can make the movie. And it's so true, and it's also on a subconscious level, but he puts so much thought into every little detail as to why it's there, what it represents, what it's symbolizing, and you watch a movie like this and you see it presented. And like you said, you do the research and you see all the little things that you didn't even notice or pick up on, and you're just like, oh my God, it is just...
It's so dense.
It's limitless.
Yeah. It's so dense with the amount of attention to detail within this film. It's fascinating.
It's also crazy that, just speaking of Dustin Hoffman and his performance and how great it is, that 1 year later he's in Midnight Cowboy playing the exact opposite of this role.
Which Mike Nichols tried to talk him out of that role.
Right.
He's like, this could be detrimental to your career. And at the time, this was still the tail end of the whole old studio system. They wanted to tie him into a 6-picture deal, I think, with this movie. And since he was very new to film, I think this is one of his first films, he was like, no, I don't want that. I don't want to be trapped in that. So they were able to pay him only $17,000 for this film,
Right.
which even at that time is really low for a lead role in a film. Yikes. To the point where when it was all said and done, taxes and living expenses, he only had $4,000 left. And he was collecting unemployment when this film premiered, which says something. I mean, that's just crazy. You're Dustin Hoffman and you're getting unemployment checks
Right.
while The Graduate is in theaters?
Cut to this comes out.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, oh, here's all my checks.
Right.
And here's all these phone calls.
Do you know the connection between this and the producers?
Yes, I do, but please share.
So Dustin Hoffman was going to play Hans Liebman in The Producers. He was set. He was cast by Mel Brooks. Gets a call. Dustin Hoffman gets a call from Mike Nichols to come and audition for the part of Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate. He has to go to Mel Brooks and say, I need to get out of this because I need to go do an audition for Mike Nichols. And Mel Brooks is like, Mike Nichols, he's doing The Graduate. And he's like, what part do you want him for The Graduate? He's like, Benjamin Braddock? That's a corn-fed, that's a healthy, good-looking boy. That's not you. Like
5'11" track star.
He's like, go do this audition. I'll see you the next day, and we'll do The Producers.
Yeah.
And the rest
then
is
he gets
history.
And Anne Bancroft, of course, Mel
Right.
Brooks' wife.
Yep.
So he knew about the film, and he knew and that's why he's like, yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
And through the whole process, Hoffman did not think he was right for this role. And a lot of the criticism he got when the film came out actually was sadly anti-Semitic. You're saying, he's got the big Jew nose and all this stuff, and just like all this horrible crap.
Yeah.
And it's like, he doesn't look like his parents for one thing, but there was like this weird contention with the film that never occurred to me watching it either.
There's a crazy story that he tells. I mean, he's always telling just completely emotional stories, Dustin Hoffman. And then he starts crying, and you're like, please
stop, please.
But he tells a story about a review that came out the next day, and it basically called him a cretin.
Yeah.
A cretin with a big nose, I think was the phrase, and it's just like,
What? What does that have to do with anything? That's terrible.
All right.
You want to round this out with a little bit of trivia?
Sure.
The scene where Benjamin and Mrs. Robinson are about to tryst for the first time, and he just grabs her boob while she's undressing. He just did it. He just did it in the moment, and his motivation for it was, this is a nervous school kid, and what do schoolboys want to do? They just want to grab boobies. So he just does it. Anne Bancroft, of course, being a pro, is just kind of like, all right, well, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. Mike Nichols loses it. He's laughing off camera to the point where Dustin Hoffman starts laughing. If you notice, he turns away from camera like this, and it looks like shame or like, I don't know what I'm doing. And then he retreats to the back of the room and starts banging his head against the wall in like a almost like nervous fit, to where she's like, what are you doing? And he's like, no, this is bad. He's going back there to try to stop laughing.
Right.
And he's banging his head against the wall to be, stop it, stop laughing, stop laughing. Now I need to watch it again so I can see that moment, because those are my favorite. When people break in scenes and they're all like, I'm going to hide it somehow, it makes me laugh every single time.
And it's so great, like, there's some times where you can just tell that the scene breaks and then they cut. But that moment holds, and it speaks to the professionalism of Anne Bancroft for, I'm going to pick up what you're throwing down and go with it in an unexpected way.
Yeah.
And then he just has to turn, and then just, okay, how can I turn this into something other than, I can bang my head against the wall to stop from laughing, but it's going to read as nervousness.
Yeah. Also, they were completely memorized before they even started shooting, which is uncharacteristic for films.
Yeah.
Normally you do scene by scene, but they treated it like stage, and they were all completely memorized to the point where Kathleen Ross said at one point that they could take the show on the road because they were all so solid in their performances.
He says this in the commentary, but just like with when he did Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, they had 3 weeks rehearsal and it's just crazy that they had that much time for a Hollywood production, but you just get so much out of it.
It's amazing what you can get when you just sit down and rehearse a little bit. And if you have this caliber of talent, it's gonna just show in spades, and that's what this movie is. You mentioned the landlord in that scene. There's an actor who steps in and says, "Shall I get the cops? I'll get the cops." That is a young Richard Dreyfuss.
Another connection to Jaws.
There you go. It's all about Jaws. When Dustin Hoffman initially went in to audition for the film, he was mistaken for a messenger. I've read two different accounts. I read that he was mistaken for a messenger and a window cleaner. And the one about the window cleaner says that he stayed in character and cleaned a window. Because he's like, all right, well, I'll clean a window then. Yeah, that's all I've got. You want to do a little bit of film school before we get out of here?
Sure.
You mentioned that the long shot, or the long lenses, the one that is known from this film is when he's running to the church.
Yep.
And they use a really long telephoto lens to make it look like he's running in place.
Yep.
He's running very fast, and they did a bunch of takes to it, to the point where he fainted and needed oxygen. But he's just running and running and running and running at the camera, and they just keep zooming out with that long lens so it doesn't look like he's making any progress whatsoever.
Right. And it's so, like, it is so hard to do, and it speaks to, so Robert Surtees is the cinematographer, and he was just a old school Hollywood cinematographer that, you know, knew everything. But that is just such a hard shot to do. And the fact that, you know, it'd be one thing if that was just the shot that, you know, you keep him in place. But then at a certain point, it zooms out all the way, gets the church in there, and he runs into the church.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Because not only are you zooming out, but you still have to maintain focus.
Right.
So you got two things going on
We
at
know
once.
how hard that is.
Yeah. Yes, we do. The music, we talked about it a little bit, but this is one of the few films I know where the score is almost its own being. The soundtrack from Simon and Garfunkel does create the perfect mood for the film. Everything about it is kind of ethereal and almost mystic, and like it doesn't feel real. Because that's what you feel like in your 20s. You're like just kind of floating around, not sure what's happening to you.
Right. And it feels like Benjamin's voice in the sense that if you just had him speaking dialogue about, like, if any scene in this film he was trying to, you know, talk about everything that he was feeling inside, you know, it would just be numbing.
Yeah.
But the music just does that work for you. And two awesome pieces of trivia with that is that Mike Nichols was just given the record by his brother
Oh, really?
at some point during pre-production, and he was just listening to it. And at a certain point, he just was like, "Oh, schmuck, you're listening to the music that's going to be in your movie." And then also with Mrs. Robinson, which, contrary to popular belief, does not appear in this film in its in the form that everyone knows.
In the studio or the album release, yeah.
So they needed another song. Mike Nichols and Simon and Garfunkel were in the studio. He kept playing different songs that he was making up, and Mike Nichols didn't like any of them. And he's like, "All right, give us 5 minutes." They went in, they came out, and they started playing "Here's to You, Mrs. Robinson." And Mike Nichols is just like, "Where the hell did that come from?" And he's like, "Well, we had a song called Here's to You, Mrs. Roosevelt, and we just put in Mrs. Robinson."
Yeah.
And that's great.
Because what does that song doesn't make sense.
Right.
But if it's Mrs. Roosevelt, that makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah.
there you have
But there's great
the
stuff
theme
like
song
when
of The Graduate.
as he's driving, and you know, you can tell that Paul Simon is just playing with the movie, and you know, he slams his hand on the counter, and Paul Simon does a little stinger. Great stuff. Just before we wrap up, just a couple of influences in terms of, you know, talked about Wes Anderson and James L. Brooks and Alexander Payne in terms of the tone and that shift between comedy and drama and doing it within the same scene. There's always a danger with this film because it is so revolutionary and influential that it's almost a kiss of death to say that a film is like or reminiscent of The Graduate.
Sure.
You know, every film that comes out that is about a young adult or about a teenager going through, you know, a coming of age is lauded as the next Graduate or the Graduate for this generation. You know, the Garden State.
Yep. The first one that came to mind too.
Right. If any film is going to be lauded as the next Graduate, I think The Social Network is a film that, again, nothing to do with The Graduate but in the sense that it is about a young adult going through a coming of age. And also I think there is a direct line that you can draw from Benjamin and Elaine on that bus with those stares on their face to Jesse Eisenberg as Mark Zuckerberg hitting that refresh button at the end of Social Network with that same blank expression on his face of, you know, I have everything and yet I have nothing.
Yep. Where to watch? The usual places. iTunes, Amazon, all those. $2.99, $3.99. Not having a membership to Filmstruck. I don't know if it's there. I'm sure it is because it's Criterion Collection. But most importantly, and why we're doing it this week, is there is another Fathom event coming up on Sunday, April 23rd, and Wednesday, April 26th at 2 and 7 p.m.s. Once again, at Palace 9 Cinemas in South Burlington.
Please go. It's going to be amazing. Like I can't wait to see this film on the big screen because I never have. And just to see these great moments and hear the music and see all those great transitions on the big screen is just going to be amazing. And I know we're going to go.
Yeah.
If Robin doesn't go, she's going to hit me. So.
Well, then I don't know if Rachel's going to go.
Right.
We haven't talked about it.
Right.
We got some time.
All right.
But we'll probably be there. Great. Well, that has been The Graduate. What are we doing next week?
Oh my God, an hour's not enough.
You gushed plenty.
Yeah.
What are we doing next week?
Next week we are doing The Red Shoes. Beautiful, beautiful movie from England. It is Pressburger. It is basically, if you love Black Swan, this is the movie that influenced Black Swan. It is about ballet, it's about suffering for your art, and all that great stuff. So
Excellent.
It is an excellent, excellent movie.
All right. Well, be sure to like us on Facebook and Instagram and all the other places. And we hope you're enjoying the show. Please reach out to us. We love feedback. We love interacting with folks. So let us know you're there. All right, so for Vermont Film Essentials, I'm Lincoln L. Hayes.
And I am David Metzger.
Thanks for watching and listening. We'll see you next week.